Our next subsection, using NCC Volume 1, will have a focus on how to use NCC Volume 1 to find and interpret information about performance requirements and compliance solutions for Class 2 to 9 buildings, and also some Class 1 and Class 10 buildings and structures. So what we're going to discuss, we'll have a look at what NCC Volume 1 contains and where to get guidance on using Volume 1. We'll look at how NCC Volume 1 is organised and how to find information within it. We'll look at some key concepts in Volume 1 and how to interpret the different sections of that volume. So what does Volume 1 of the NCC contain? Volume 1 is on requirements for multi-residential, commercial, industrial and public institutional buildings. The provisions within NCC Volume 1 that apply to Class 1 and 10 buildings generally relate to access for people with a disability. Volume 1 of the NCC is sometimes referred to as BCA Volume 1, as we discussed earlier, and sits as a set within the three NCC documents alongside Volume 2 and the Plumbing Code of Australia, or PCA. So how is it organised? To be able to use Volume 1 effectively, it's best to understand how this volume is organised. So Section A contains the governing requirements, which are the same in all three volumes of the NCC. This includes information on building classifications and reference documents, and this was discussed earlier in our section on understanding the NCC. Sections B to J contain all the performance requirements, verification methods, and deemed to satisfy provisions for Volume 1. That is, all those applicable to Class 2 to 9 buildings, and as mentioned, some Class 1B and Class 10 buildings and structures. This includes performance requirements, verification methods, and deemed to satisfy provisions for building structure, health, independence, comfort and well-being, so amenity, safety, including fire safety, access and safe movement, a building's energy efficiency, and a range of other aspects and special building types. Deemed to satisfy provisions for Volume 1 often include specifications which provide detailed requirements for using some deemed to satisfy provisions. They must be complied with when developing a deemed to satisfy solution. The structure of Volume 1 is similar to the structure of Volume 3, which we also noted, with the performance requirements, verification methods, and deemed to satisfy provisions grouped across different sections. This is different from Volume 2, where performance requirements and verification methods are all gathered together in Volume 2, with the deemed to satisfy provisions located in a separate housing provision standard, which we'll chat about later. Volume 1 contains the same schedules as the other volumes. Most of the text in the schedules is identical across the three volumes, but the contents of Schedules 4 to 11, State and Territory Appendices, varies. As the schedules are more or less the same across all volumes of the NCC, as we have discussed before, we'll go through that in a bit more detail later again. We will now go through some key concepts in Volume 1, the first being rising stories. The rise in stories has an impact on a building's risk of a few things, such as exposure to radiant heat from a fire in another building, emitting radiant heat to another building, which might cause damage to the other building or cause it to also catch on fire, and occupants who may need to travel down a stairway to safely evacuate the building. A building's rising stories is referenced in Section C, D, E, and G of NCC Volume 1 and can determine which particular provisions might apply to a building. So, for example, it's central to identifying which rules apply when ensuring that a building can resist fire appropriately. A number of concessions around fire resistance provisions depend in part of the building's rising stories. This means that some provisions may not apply to a building below a certain rising stories, provided other conditions are met. So an example is C4D8, which is protection of doorways in horizontal exits, or C4D11, openings in fire-isolated lift shafts. The number and locations of fire exits in Class 9B buildings can depend in part on each building's rising stories. The rising stories of a building is used to determine the type of construction along with the building's classification, which we'll have a look at next. In Volume 1, the rise of stories of a building generally means the number of stories above the natural ground level and any story within roof space. I've included the definitions from the NCC for your reference for both rising story and a story itself. Figure C1.22, which you can see on the right, is also included on this slide. Will give you examples of calculating the rising stories of a building. It's probably worth looking at these in detail in your own time if you aren't already across them from your time in practice. Part C2D3 of Volume 1 discusses the way in which we calculate the rising stories. It's important to note that a story is not counted if it is situated at the top of a building and is only used for services such as 2A, or if it is situated partly below the finished ground and the underside of the ceiling is not more than 1 metre above the average ground level at the external wall. There are further details that you can read on the slide. So calculating the rising stories. So what difference does a firewall make to the calculation of the rising stories for this multi-unit development? If you want to look further into this, you'll find the information in Part C1 of NCC Volume 1. So the answer is without the firewall, the rising stories is for the entire development. In other words, the two-story section must also be built to meet the fire protection provisions that apply for the four-story section on the left of our diagram. Within the firewall, the rising stories is 4 for the left section and 2 for the bit on the right. So the provisions that would apply to each section are potentially different. This doesn't mean that the builder would automatically build the two sections to different standards, by the way. Our next key concept is type of construction. The type of construction required for a building depends on a combination of the building classification and the rising stories, which we had a look at on the last slide. These two factors determine the risk to the building, other buildings, and the occupants from fire. So, for example, the building classification points to a building's likely use, fire load, population, and the mobility of its occupants. So, for example, whether or not they're likely to be sleeping or if they're alert. The height of the building determines the likely evacuation time and difficulty. Thus, these two factors are used to determine the minimum types of fire-resisting construction required for Class 2 to 9 buildings. The exact requirements for each type of construction are contained in Specification 5 in Volume 1. Some other factors will also determine fire resistance construction requirements, such as the size of individual fire compartments or atriums in a building. There are special rules for some configurations of some building classifications. So, for example, buildings with multiple classifications, and that you'll find in Part C2D4. Two-story Class 2, 3 or 9C buildings, and that you'll find in C2D6, or Class 4 parts of buildings, which you'll find in Part C2D7. Some buildings can have more than one type of construction. The requirements in Table C2D2, which you can see at the bottom of our slide, are deemed to satisfy provisions, and an architect builder always has the option of developing a performance solution to meet the performance requirements. Another key concept, fire compartments. Let's have a look at fire compartments in the NCC. The maximum floor area of fire compartments required for a building depends on a combination of the building classification and the type of construction, which we had a look at on the last slide. The requirements in Table C3D3, which you can see here at the bottom of the slide, are also deemed to satisfy provisions, and an architect builder always has the option of developing a performance solution to meet the performance requirements, as we noted again on the last slide too. Alternatively, an architect or builder can choose to use a different type of construction, which would change the requirements for fire compartmentation. So, for example, a building may only be required to be built using Type C construction if this would result in a space or spaces or fire compartments that are too small to be practical for the purpose of the building, then the architect or builder could use a more fire-resistant type of construction, i.e. Type B or Type A. This would then allow the design and building of larger spaces while still complying with the performance requirements. There are special rules for large isolated buildings of class 5 to 9, and that sits under C3D4 if you want to take a look. So let's have a look at what sections B to J contain. So while there are different sections that provide performance requirements, verification methods, and deemed to satisfy provisions for specific design and building areas, they must be applied holistically. That is, you need to consider the impact of a decision on one area on requirements in the other areas. So an example of a holistic application is formulating a performance solution to increase the prescribed distance of travel to an exit, section D, of access and egress, which may affect the coverage requirements for the firefighting equipment, section E, services and equipment. Section B contains structural provisions that apply to all classes of buildings. Sections C to J specify provisions that generally apply to particular classes and types of buildings. However, these provisions don't necessarily apply to all buildings of a particular classification. They are sometimes limited to buildings that meet other criteria as well, such as building height, floor area, number of people the building will accommodate, and the layout of the building. Sections in Volume 1 are organised in different ways. There are two main variants in the organisation. Some sections list all the relevant performance requirements first, then list all the verification methods, and then they'll give all the deemed to satisfy provisions, including specifications where relevant. Other sections are divided into parts, which cover a particular topic, and each part then contains the applicable performance requirements, verification methods, and deemed to satisfy provisions. It's really important to check each section to make sure you understand how it's organised. So how do we, as architects, use Volume 1? First, we'd identify the building's classification, the rising stories, and the required type of construction. From there, we'd identify any applicable performance requirements, verification methods, and deemed to satisfy provisions in sections B through to J. We then would check definition and note exceptions, limitations and state variations to any performance requirements, verification methods, or deemed to satisfy provisions. And from there, we'd decide on a use of a deemed to satisfy solution, a performance solution, or potentially a combination of the two. So to summarise, the governing requirements, exactly the same as the other volumes. Sections B through to J hold the performance requirements, verification methods, deemed to satisfy provisions including specifications, and the schedules are exactly the same as the other volumes. So key points. Section B structural provisions will apply to all building classes. Sections C to J provisions generally apply to particular classes and types of buildings but may have limitations. Key concepts in Volume 1, rise in stories, type of construction, fire compartments. Different sections are organised in different ways, and they may have parts which group performance requirements, verification methods, and deemed to satisfy provisions under topic areas. The following documents on the ABCB website provide additional non-mandatory guidance, and I'll link across to these in the guidance elements for the ABCB website.